I'm really glad you're here. If you're using this video to wind down or drift off to sleep, you're in the right place. Before we get started, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. I'd also love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? All right, go ahead, get comfortable, settle in, and just relax. He almost didn't open the attic door. The grief was still too fresh, too heavy, like wet wool draped over his shoulders. Daniel had been putting it off for weeks, clearing out his mother's house. Every box smelled like her perfume. Every corner held a memory he wasn't ready to face. But the real estate agent had been gentle and firm. The buyer wanted to close in 10 days. So on a gray October afternoon in Willow Creek, Pennsylvania, Daniel climbed the creaking pull-down stairs, flashlight in hand, and entered the quiet tomb of his mother's past. That's where he found it. Tucked behind a stack of old quilts, a tin lockbox he'd never seen before. No label, just a small brass key taped to the bottom. His fingers trembled as he turned the key. Inside, pressed between faded silk, lay a photograph. A black-and-white image of a man and a woman locked in a desperate, beautiful kiss on a train platform. She was young, radiant, her head tilted back, a laugh caught in her throat. He held her waist as if the world was ending. In the background, a station clock read 5 past midnight. And when Daniel turned the photograph over, he saw his mother's delicate handwriting. Grandview Station, July 12, 1963. If only we hadn't boarded that train. The question hit him like a slow-moving train itself. What train? And who was the man who looked at her like she was the only truth he'd ever known? Daniel stared at the words until they blurred. His mother, Eleanor, had never mentioned a Grandview Station. She'd never spoken of any train trip in 1963. She'd certainly never talked about a kiss that looked like it could start a war or end one. She had been a quiet woman, a librarian at the Willow Creek Public Library for 40 years. She raised him alone after his father, Robert, died in a construction accident before Daniel was born, or so the story went. But this photograph didn't fit the narrative. The woman in the image was undeniably Eleanor. Same high cheekbones, same gentle curve of her neck. But the man, he was a stranger. Dark hair, sharp jaw, eyes that held both tenderness and a kind of wild resolve. He wasn't Robert. Daniel's mind raced. Who was he? Why had his mother hidden this? And what did she mean by, "If only we hadn't boarded that train"? He rummaged further into the lockbox. His fingers brushed against a yellowed newspaper clipping, a silver locket, and a pink train ticket stub. The clipping was folded so tightly it cracked when he opened it. The headline screamed from the past: "Mystery of the Midnight Express. 2 missing. Rumors of stolen state secrets." Date: July 13th, 1963, the day after the photograph. Suddenly, the dusty attic felt alive with ghosts. His mother's secret love and a national mystery were stitched together by a single train station. and Daniel knew, with a chill that crawled up his spine, that his life was about to become a history lesson no textbook ever dared to print. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He spread the contents of the lockbox across his mother's kitchen table, the same table where she'd served him oatmeal every morning before school. Now it held the evidence of a life she'd buried. He made coffee at 3 a.m., sat under the fluorescent hum, and let the past swallow him whole. Eleanor Jane Harper, his mother, had been a quiet pillar of Willow Creek. She always wore cardigans, always knew exactly the right book to recommend to a grieving widow or a lonely teenager. She never missed a single one of his baseball games, even when the team lost 17-0. So who was that woman in the photograph, and why did she look so alive, so on fire, so utterly unlike the mother he thought he knew? He opened the locket. Inside, a tiny curl of baby hair and a miniature photo of an infant. Him, he realized, his own newborn face. On the other side, an inscription, "To my son, my reason." The ticket stub was stamped for Track 3, Grandview, Ohio, departure 11:55 p.m. The newspaper article detailed the infamous Midnight Express, a luxury train from Chicago to Washington, D.C. that had made an unscheduled stop in Grandview. 2 passengers vanished. A diplomatic briefcase carrying sensitive intelligence disappeared. The conductor was found confused, claiming he saw a woman in a blue dress and a man in a fedora slipping into the night. No bodies ever found. Rumors swirled of a Soviet spy, a rogue journalist, and a sum of money that could buy silence. Daniel's mother was the woman in the blue dress. He knew it in his bones. The next morning, he called his friend Sarah. Sarah was a journalist for the Philadelphia Inquirer, someone who chased facts the way others chased sunsets. He'd known her since college. She was the closest thing he had to a sister. When he told her what he found, she didn't laugh. She didn't say he was overreacting. She was silent for a long moment, then asked, "What's the date on that article again?" He told her. She pulled up old archives on her end while he held his breath. What she found made the kitchen feel 10 degrees colder. The Midnight Express incident wasn't just a local mystery, it was a buried footnote in Cold War history. Senator Harlan Cross, a powerful figure on the Intelligence Committee, had been on that train. He'd suffered a fatal heart attack the next morning in his Washington hotel, but rumors persisted for decades that he'd been poisoned or that the missing briefcase contained evidence of his treason. The FBI investigated, then abruptly closed the case. 2 obscure names were briefly mentioned as persons of interest: Jack Vance, a freelance journalist with a reputation for digging into government corruption, and an unnamed female companion. The description matched the man in the photograph. Jack Vance, his mother's secret lover. Daniel felt the floor shift beneath him. This wasn't just a hidden romance, it was a story that tangled with national security, with a dead senator, with a mystery that altered intelligence protocols. And his mother, the librarian who knitted scarves and hummed Beatles tunes, was right at the center of it. Daniel had been a high school history teacher for 12 years. He taught teenagers about the Cold War, about the Red Scare, about the Bay of Pigs every single semester. He'd even used the Midnight Express as a trivia question. What mysterious train disappearance was linked to a U.S. senator's death? Now the lesson plan was staring back at him from his own kitchen table, with his own mother's face caught in the crosshairs. He felt a strange, hollow anger rising. Why hadn't she told him? All those years she could have said something. She could have prepared him. But then a softer voice reminded him. Eleanor Harper had spent her entire life protecting him from something. The lie about Robert dying before he was born, it wasn't just to simplify the story, it was a shield. Daniel began to wonder if Robert ever existed at all. Maybe the man he'd called his father was a fiction designed to cover a deeper, more dangerous truth. He opened the newspaper clipping again and read the smaller print. A station attendant described the mysterious woman as maybe in her 20s, brunette with a quiet kind of beauty. She looked sad even when she smiled. That was his mother. But what about Jack Vance? The article said he was last seen sprinting across the tracks, a leather satchel in his hand, with federal agents in pursuit. He was never caught. The satchel was never recovered. Some said he'd disappeared into the Ohio River. Others said he'd taken a new identity in Canada. All Daniel knew was that this man, this ghost, had loved his mother, and possibly, just possibly, was his real father. The thought planted itself like a seed and would not let go. That night, Sarah drove down from Philadelphia. She arrived a little after 8, carrying a laptop bag and a box of donuts, which she placed on the table as if this were just another all-nighter. The two of them sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by printouts and notepads, while the rain began to tap against the windows. Sarah had pulled FBI files from a database she wouldn't name. The official report on the Midnight Express incident had large sections redacted, entire paragraphs swallowed by black ink. But one uncovered detail made Sarah stop mid-sentence. A witness, a porter who'd been on the platform that night, testified that the woman in the blue dress seemed to be with child. The report called it a possible early pregnancy. Daniel's heart hammered. He did the math. July 1963. He was born in April 1964. 9 months. He was that child. Suddenly, the secret wasn't just about Cold War intrigue or missing documents. It was about his own origin. Jack Vance wasn't just a phantom from history. He was Daniel's biological father. And his mother, the quiet librarian, had carried the secret of his paternity, the secret of a fugitive love, right to her grave. Sarah put a hand on his shoulder. She didn't say, "I'm sorry," or "This is insane." She just sat there while the rain fell. After a long silence, Daniel whispered, "She must have been so scared." And in that moment, anger dissolved into something else, a deep, aching compassion for the young woman in the blue dress who had loved a man so dangerous and so true that she had to erase him from history just to keep her son safe. The next morning, necessity pushed grief aside. Daniel needed to know where Grandview Station was and if anything of the past still stood. He pulled up maps. Grandview, Ohio was a small town about 4 hours west, near the Pennsylvania border, a once bustling rail hub that had dried up when the interstate came through. The station itself was decommissioned in 1984, left to the weeds and the raccoons. But the building was still there, according to county records, sitting on a forgotten spur of track like a fossil. Sarah offered to go with him, but Daniel said no. This was a pilgrimage he had to make alone. He packed a bag, left his keys with a neighbor for the cat, and climbed into his old Subaru. The drive was long and gray, the sky heavy with unshed rain. He played no music, just let the sound of the tires fill the silence. His mind churned through every memory of his mother, the way she'd read him The Velveteen Rabbit, the vanilla scent of her hand lotion, the single framed photo of her wedding day. But in that photo, the groom's face was turned away, as if even the camera had been trained to hide. Had she spent her whole marriage looking over her shoulder? When her stepfather, Robert Harper, died in 1979, she'd worn black for a year, but never spoke of him again. Now Daniel understood. Robert hadn't been the love of her life. He'd been a refuge, a quiet harbor after a storm no one was allowed to know about. As the miles passed, the landscape flattened into farm fields and silos. He felt like he was driving not just to a place, but back in time, toward the hidden crossroads where his identity was forged. He arrived in Grandview at dusk. The town was one of those places that time had half forgotten. A main street with a closed five-and-dime, a diner still hanging on, and a water tower that hadn't been painted in decades. The air smelled of damp leaves and diesel from the freight line that still rumbled through without stopping. The station sat on the eastern edge, a brick building with boarded-up windows and a sagging roof, silhouetted against a bruised purple sky. A chain-link fence surrounded it, but a section had been cut away years ago, and a path of beaten earth led to a side door. Daniel parked the car, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped into the kind of silence that made his own heartbeat sound like a drum. The door creaked open, and he entered the ghost of 1963. Inside, the waiting room was a cathedral of dust. Wooden benches rotted in neat rows. The schedule board still held faded chalk marks, the last train listed as MEX 1155, Washington, D.C., canceled. The ticket counter was gutted, but the old clock on the wall was frozen at 12:05. He stood there, imagining her, his mother, Eleanor, young and pregnant, standing right here, waiting for a train that would change everything. The photograph in his pocket seemed to pulse with warmth. Then his flashlight beam caught something, a row of brass lockers along the far wall, most hanging open and empty, except one, locker 17. It was locked, and the number matched the faded stamp on the pink ticket stub he'd found in the lockbox. Daniel's pulse quickened as he pulled the small brass key from his jacket, the one taped to the bottom of the lockbox. It fit perfectly. With a rusty groan, the locker door swung open. Inside, untouched for nearly 6 decades, lay a leather satchel, the same satchel, he imagined, that Jack Vance had been seen clutching as he fled across the tracks. Daniel lifted it out with reverent hands, setting it on one of the benches. The leather was cracked, the brass buckle green with age, but it was intact. He unbuckled it slowly. Inside were letters, dozens of them, tied with a faded blue ribbon. They were all in the same handwriting, his mother's, addressed to "My dearest Jack." and beneath the letters a small leather-bound journal, its pages still legible. The first entry was dated March 1963. He angled the flashlight and began to read aloud, his voice a thin whisper in the cavernous room. I never believed in love at first sight until the night I missed my train and found you standing under the station clock. You asked if I needed help. I said I needed a miracle. You laughed and said you were fresh out of miracles, but you could offer a coffee. I took the coffee, and I've been taking pieces of my heart back ever since. Daniel's voice broke. This wasn't a historical document. It was the intimate. The journal spoke of a spring and summer drenched in improbable love. Eleanor had been a librarian in Grandview then, a temporary job while she cared for an ailing aunt. She'd traveled to the station that night to catch the last train to Columbus, but missed it by 30 seconds. Jack Vance was there charging his camera battery from a maintenance outlet, a freelance journalist chasing a story about railroad corruption. He was tall, with ink-stained fingers and a smile that made her forget her own name. They talked until the sun came up, sitting on the platform with their legs dangling over the tracks. He told her about his work, about a senator named Harlan Cross, about a briefcase full of secrets that could topple powerful men. She told him about her love of Russian novels and her quiet fear that her life would never amount to more than a series of careful, small decisions. By May, they were inseparable. By June, she was pregnant and terrified. By July, they hatched a plan. The journal described it with painful clarity. Jack had learned that Senator Cross would be on the Midnight Express on July 12th, carrying a briefcase with microfilm that proved he was selling intelligence to the Soviets. Jack intended to intercept the briefcase, copy the microfilm, and hand the originals to a trusted reporter at the Washington Post. Eleanor was to create a diversion in the dining car, a spilled drink, a fainting spell, while Jack made the switch in the baggage compartment. But the journal's final entry, written the morning of the 12th, was shaky. Jack says, if anything goes wrong, I am to leave the train at Grandview, retrieve the satchel from locker 17, and hide. He says no matter what, I must protect our child. I have never been so afraid or so brave. Tonight, love becomes history, one way or another. That was the last line. Daniel closed the journal and sat in the heavy silence, knowing that whatever happened next on that train platform in 1963 had shaped his entire existence. Daniel spent the night in a motel on the edge of Grandview, the kind with a buzzing neon sign and curtains that didn't quite close. He couldn't sleep. The letters from the satchel were spread across the polyester bedspread, arranged in chronological order. They covered the weeks after the Midnight Express incident. His mother's handwriting grew more frantic, then more resigned. On July 20, she wrote, "The papers say you're a fugitive. They call it espionage, but I know you only wanted the truth. I'm hiding in Philadelphia with the baby kicking inside me, and all I can do is love you from a distance I cannot measure. On August 2, I can't come to you. They're watching the post, the phones. I named him Daniel after your grandfather. He has your eyes." Daniel's breath caught. She had named him for a grandfather he'd never met, a lineage he'd never known. He was the child of two people caught in the crossfire of history. And one of them was still out there, maybe dead, maybe not. The letters spanned years. They were never mailed. Instead, Eleanor would write them and hide them in Locker 17 during rare trips back to Grandview, as if the station itself was a sacred mailbox between worlds. One letter, dated 1971, was shorter. I married Robert. He's kind. He knows the truth, but promises to raise Daniel as his own. I will never stop loving you, but I must stop writing. I must protect him. Forgive me. The last letter was 1982, a single page. Daniel graduated 8th grade. He won the history bee. Ironic, isn't it? The son of the man who changed history, celebrating it. I hope wherever you are, you can see him. He's so much like you. Love forever, E. Daniel folded the last letter and wept. The next morning, Daniel returned to the station. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean and cold. He stood on the platform where his parents might have shared that last desperate kiss. The clock tower loomed, still frozen, and he felt a strange sense of alignment, as if time itself had bent to keep this story intact for him to find. He needed to understand the rest, the missing pieces that even the letters didn't explain. What had actually happened on the train, and what became of Jack? The newspaper archives only told the official story. Senator Harlan Cross had died of natural causes the next morning, but a leaked autopsy years later suggested traces of a fast-acting toxin. The briefcase with the microfilm was never found. Jack Vance was declared a person of interest, then quietly forgotten after the FBI closed the case. No trial, no resolution. But there had to be more. Daniel remembered the name of a local woman mentioned in one of Sarah's articles, a retired school teacher named Marion Henshaw, who had given a statement to a regional paper in 1998 about that night. She claimed she'd seen the senator arguing with a man in a conductor's uniform minutes before the unscheduled stop. She lived in a nursing home just 20 minutes away. So Daniel bought a bouquet of daisies from a roadside stand and drove to Maplewood Retirement Village, hoping that the last living witness could tell him what the government never would. The maze of hallways smelled of antiseptic and potpourri, and in room 204 he found a woman with bright, intelligent eyes and a memory as sharp as broken glass. Marion Henshaw was 92, with trembling hands but a voice that carried the weight of unspoken truths. She took the daisies and inhaled them before fixing Daniel with a look that went straight through him. "You're Eleanor's boy," she said without preamble. "You have her chin and Jack's eyes." Daniel was too stunned to respond. She motioned him to sit on the floral armchair. For the next hour, she poured out the story she'd kept locked inside for 60 years. She had been a waitress on the Midnight Express that night, serving coffee in the dining car. She knew Eleanor casually from the library. When she saw her board the train in Grandview, pale and quiet, she felt something was wrong. Marion's station was near the baggage compartment. She saw Jack Vance slip inside, dressed as a conductor. She saw him open the senator's briefcase and photograph documents with a small spy camera. But then Senator Cross himself appeared, having felt suspicious. There was a struggle. The briefcase flew open. The microfilm canister rolled across the floor. Jack snatched it and ran. The senator clutched his chest and collapsed. Heart attack, just as the report said, but accelerated by the confrontation. Marion never saw a poison. She saw a man pushed past his physical limit. Then all hell broke loose. Federal agents who'd been discreetly guarding Cross stormed the car. Eleanor created the diversion, knocking over a cart of dishes, giving Jack a head start. He jumped from the train as it slowed for a signal near an overpass. She stayed on the train, calm as stone, until the next stop, where she slipped away into the night. Marion helped her by hiding her in her own apartment for 3 days. That was the truth. No espionage, no Soviet plot, at least not directly. Jack had stolen evidence of the senator's treason, and history had twisted it into a spy thriller with the wrong villain. And Eleanor, the librarian, had been the bravest of them all. "That canister," Marion said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "contained a list of American agents operating in Eastern Europe. If it had fallen into the wrong hands, dozens of lives would have been lost. Your father didn't steal it for money or ideology. He stole it to give to a journalist who could expose the senator without destroying those agents. He was a hero, Daniel, but heroes don't always get parades." She reached into her bedside drawer and pulled out a small leather pouch. Inside was a key, a safe deposit box key, with a tag that read First National Trust, Harrisburg, PA. Eleanor left this with me years ago, in case anything ever happened to her. She said if her son ever came asking questions, I should give him this. She knew, Daniel. She knew you would find your way here. Daniel's hand shook as he took the key. His mother had planted breadcrumbs across time, trusting that someday he would be brave enough to follow them. He asked Marion what happened to Jack. She pressed her lips together. After that night, Jack went underground. He changed his name, moved from town to town. He never stopped loving your mother, but he knew if he got close, the Bureau would find him, and they'd use you as leverage. He sent money when he could, through me. A few times a year, I'd get an envelope with cash and a note for Daniel's education. Your college fund, that was him, every cent. Daniel felt the room tilt. The anonymous scholarships, the birthday checks from a family friend, they'd all been from a father he'd never met, loving him in the shadows.
Daniel left Maplewood with the key burning a hole in his pocket and a new weight in his chest, not of grief, but of profound, disorienting gratitude. His mother had loved him enough to lie. His father had loved him enough to stay away, and he had lived 40 years in a bubble of carefully constructed safety, never knowing the sacrifices that had been made. The drive to Harrisburg took 2 hours. He called Sarah from the road, updating her in fragmented sentences. She was quiet, then said, "You realize this isn't just your story anymore. This is history, the real history of what happened on the Midnight Express.
If we can confirm Jack's identity and find that microfilm, the record can be corrected. Your parents can be vindicated. Daniel hadn't thought that far. He'd been chasing ghosts for personal reasons. But Sarah was right. This could rewrite a Cold War footnote. The thought was exhilarating and terrifying. He arrived at First National Trust just before closing, a granite building with columns that seemed to belong to a more dignified era. The manager, a balding man named Mr. Finch, inspected the key and the identification Daniel offered. After a few phone calls to verify his mother's death certificate, the manager led him to a private room and handed over a long metal box. "It's been waiting since 1964, he said. Daniel slid back the lid. Inside were neatly stacked documents. Jack Vance's original passport under the name John Victor, a birth certificate for Daniel listing father as John Victor, a marriage certificate for Eleanor Harper and John Victor, dated 1964 in a small Maryland town. They'd been legally married in secret. And a letter, yellowed but crisp, addressed simply to Daniel. The letter was dated 1989, his mother's handwriting again, but this time there was a steadiness to it, a calm resolve. Daniel sat in the quiet bank room and read the words that had waited 3 decades for him. My dearest Daniel, if you're reading this, then I have finally set down my burden. I always hoped you would never have to know the truth, that you could live a simple, happy life without the shadows I carried. But I also knew that a curious, brave boy who grew up to be a history teacher might one day go searching for his own. I've left clues not to torment you, but to lead you here, to this truth. You were born of a great love and a necessary lie. The man you knew as your father, Robert Harper, was a kind and noble stand-in, but your real father is a man named Jack Vance, or John Victor as he came to be called. He's not a traitor. He's the one who exposed Senator Cross and saved the lives of agents whose names you'll never know. He's been living alone in a small town in Montana under the name Jacob Vane. He never stopped watching over you from afar. If he's still alive when you read this, find him. Tell him the wait is over. Tell him I never stopped loving him. Forgive me for the secrets. I did what I thought was best. You were and are the best of both of us. With all my love, Mom. Daniel read it 3 times. Then he folded it carefully, slipped it into his pocket, and walked out into a sunset that felt like the closing of one chapter and the terrifying, hopeful opening of another.
The flight to Montana was the longest of Daniel's, even though it was only a few hours. He landed in Missoula, rented a car, and drove southwest toward a dot on the map called Bitterroot Creek. The landscape was vast and unforgiving, mountains capped with early snow, rivers that cut through pine valleys, sky so big it made him feel insignificant and empowered all at once. He called Sarah again from a roadside diner. She'd been digging into the Jack Vance files with new context. The microfilm Jack took, it didn't just list agents, it also contained evidence that Cross was part of a larger network selling secrets to the KGB. When the Washington Post received an anonymous package in late July 1963, they published a series of articles that led to closed-door hearings. 3 other senators resigned. An entire spy ring was dismantled, but the source was never revealed. They called it Deep Throat's predecessor.
That was your father, Daniel. He literally changed the course of the Cold War without anyone knowing his name." Daniel sat speechless, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand. His father was a ghost who had saved countless lives while the world labeled him a fugitive. The injustice of it was staggering. But then he thought of his mother's quiet life, a librarian who never sought recognition, just safety. She and Jack had made a choice, truth at the cost of being erased. He understood now. History wasn't just dates and treaties. It was hidden love letters, stolen microfilm, and a man giving up his family to keep them safe. The diner jukebox played an old Patsy Cline song about lost love, and Daniel smiled bitterly at the cosmic timing. He found the address from a property record search, a small cabin on a dirt road off Highway 93. The drive there took him through a tunnel of bare aspen trees, their white trunks glowing in the slanting afternoon light. The cabin was modest, smoke curling from a stone chimney, an old pickup truck parked out front. Behind it, a creek gurgled, and the whole scene was so peaceful it felt sacred. Daniel's heart hammered as he walked up the porch steps. Before he could knock, the door opened. An old man stood there, tall and stooped, with gray hair and deep-set eyes. Those eyes, the same eyes Daniel saw in the mirror every morning. Neither spoke for a long moment. Then the old man said, in a voice rough with age and emotion, "I knew you'd find me someday. I saw your graduation picture in the paper when you got your teaching job." That was it. The dam broke. Daniel stepped forward, and they fell into an embrace that said everything words couldn't. Dusty tools on the porch, a dog barking somewhere in the distance, and two men, father and son, holding each other for the first time in the shadow of mountains that had kept a secret for half a century. They sat on the porch in two old rocking chairs, drinking strong black coffee, as the sky turned pink and then purple. Jack, or Jacob as he'd been known for decades, talked in a slow, measured way, as if each word was a stone he was finally setting down. He told Daniel about the night of July 12th, 1963. After jumping from the train, he'd hidden in a drainage culvert until dawn, then made his way to a safe house in Cincinnati, arranged by a fellow journalist. The microfilm was developed and sent to the Washington Post with an anonymous letter. He'd wanted to turn himself in, clear his name, but the FBI was investigating the senator's death, and with Cold War paranoia at its peak, they were ready to make an example of anyone connected. A trusted contact inside the bureau warned him he'd never see a fair trial. So he vanished. He chose a new name, took odd jobs as a ranch hand, a railroad worker, a night janitor. Every year, on Daniel's birthday, he'd stand across the street from wherever Eleanor lived, watching his son blow out candles, ride a bike, go to prom. He carried a worn photo, Daniel's 8th grade graduation, in his shirt pocket, right above his heart. "You were the reason I kept going," Jacob said. "Knowing you were safe, that you'd have a normal life, that was enough." Daniel listened, tears streaming freely, and finally asked the question that had been burning. "Why didn't Mom ever come to you after I grew up? Why did she stay with Robert?" Jacob's face tightened. Because I asked her to. I made her promise. If I ever resurfaced, even decades later, they'd have reopened the case and dragged you all through the mud. She understood. She hated me for it, but she understood. That first evening, they cooked a simple meal together, canned stew and biscuits in a kitchen lined with pine paneling and old photographs. Jacob showed Daniel his mother's letters, the one she'd sent through Marion over the years. There were photos of the two of them, one taken at a county fair in early 1963, both laughing, cotton candy in hand. Next to it, a small American flag and a medal. "What's that?" Daniel asked. Jacob hesitated, then lifted the medal from its hook. It was a Distinguished Intelligence Medal, though the name was redacted. 3 years ago, a retired CIA officer tracked me down. He said the agency had quietly exonerated me in their internal files after the full scope of Cross's treason became known. They couldn't publicly acknowledge it without exposing old secrets, but they gave me this. He handed it to Daniel. It was heavy and real. Your mother saved the lives of 37 undercover agents she never knew. Daniel held the medal and felt the combined weight of injustice and belated honor. He thought of his mother sorting books at the public library, never breathing a word. She was the bravest person he'd ever known. And here was his father, living in a cabin in Montana, awarded but unknown, tending a garden and watching birds. The quiet heroes were everywhere, he realized, and history simply didn't know where to look. He looked at Jacob and said, "I want to tell the story. Not to expose you, not to hurt anyone still alive, but I want the world to know what you and Mom did. It deserves to be history, real history." Jacob was silent for a long time. Then he nodded slowly. "If you're going to do it right. Tell them about the love that started it all. Without her, I'd have been just a journalist chasing a headline. She gave me a reason to be brave." Over the next 3 days, Daniel recorded hours of interviews with Jacob. He learned the granular details, the precise layout of the train car, the make of the spy camera, a Minox B, the exact look on Eleanor's face when she fainted in the dining car, buying him precious seconds. Jacob described the moment he jumped from the train, rolling into a ditch, feeling his ankle twist, but clutching the microfilm canister like a newborn. He described the safe house in Cincinnati, the moldy basement where he waited, the knock that never came, the long bus ride west with a dead man's name. And through it all, the ache of missing Eleanor. He recited a poem he'd written for her on a napkin and never sent. Daniel wrote everything down. This was more than a history project. It was a family testament. On the final morning, Jacob gave Daniel a small, old-fashioned key. "This opens the locker at Grandview again. I've kept it all these years as a reminder. The satchel with the letters was supposed to be found by you, I think. She planned it that way. But there's one more thing hidden in the station. I placed it there in 1964, the last time I returned before going underground for good. It's under the loose floorboard beneath the ticket counter. I think it's time you had it." Daniel took the key with the same trembling reverence as before. He promised to come back soon, to share the finished manuscript, to fill the cabin with laughter and new memories. As he drove away, he watched Jacob in the rearview mirror, standing in the driveway, an old man waving until the dust settled. He didn't know if he would see him again, but at least now he knew the shape of his father's love. Instead of flying directly home, Daniel drove back to Grandview, the satchel key and the new key both tucked in his pocket. The autumn had deepened, and the old station looked even more haunted under a low ceiling of gray cloud. But it didn't feel menacing anymore. It felt like a cathedral. He let himself in the same way, flashlight in hand, and made his way to the ticket counter. The floorboard was exactly where Jacob described, third plank from the left, slightly raised. He pried it up with a pocket knife and found a small metal box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was a reel of 8mm film. Jacob had managed to take a few minutes of footage in the days before the Midnight Express. Daniel didn't have a projector, but he knew a place that might. The Grandview Historical Society, where a volunteer named Mrs. Henson had already been so helpful. He phoned her, and she agreed to meet him with an old projector she had in the basement. 30 minutes later, in the dusty back room of the society, the film spooled and flickered to life. Grainy, silent, but unmistakable. His mother, young, laughing, holding a book. Jack behind the camera, his shadow occasionally falling across the frame. Then a scene at the station itself. Eleanor spinning under the clock, coat flaring, and Jack stepping into frame to kiss her cheek. It was the photograph, but alive. Daniel wept for the childhood he'd never had, but he also smiled for the love he'd finally found. The film lasted 3 minutes, 3 minutes of proof that the heart of history beats in ordinary people doing extraordinary things for love. Back in Willow Creek, Daniel sat in his mother's empty living room, surrounded by her books and her knitting, and began to write. He was a history teacher, after all. He knew how to organize facts, how to build a narrative, how to make the past breathe. But this time, the byline was personal. He worked for 6 weeks, fueled by coffee and the steady, supportive phone calls from Sarah. She helped him fact-check, obtain declassified documents, and trace the chain of custody on the microfilm. The story was solid, undeniable, but he also knew it would stir controversy. Some still believed Jack Vance had been a Soviet agent. The families of Senator Cross might object. And then there was the legal question. Was Jack still technically a fugitive? Sarah brought in a constitutional lawyer who reviewed the case and determined that the statute of limitations on any conceivable charges had long expired. But more importantly, the documents proved the so-called theft was actually a whistleblower action that prevented greater crimes. Jack had nothing to fear. Daniel even flew to Montana again to read the manuscript to his father. Jacob listened quietly on the porch, nodding, occasionally correcting a detail. When Daniel finished, the old man said, "You made her the hero. Good, she was." They shared a long silence, the mountains listening. Then Jacob added, "Publish it. Use my real name. I've been hiding long enough. Maybe seeing my truth can help someone else come out of the shadows." Daniel released the story not as a dry historical article, but as a long-form feature in The Atlantic, accompanied by a podcast series that he narrated himself. The Soul Stories, his new channel's name, seemed fated. He titled the first series, "What Happens When Love Finds You at the Train Station Suddenly Becomes History." The response was overwhelming. Within a week, it was trending. News outlets picked it up. Historians debated. Old Cold War veterans wrote letters thanking him for setting the record straight. The little station in Grandview became a pilgrimage site. The town council voted to restore it and dedicate a plaque to Eleanor and Jack, who proved that ordinary courage and extraordinary love can change the world. Daniel spoke at the dedication ceremony, standing with Jacob, whose real identity was now public, but protected by a presidential pardon that Sarah had managed to petition for through a senator who loved the story. Jacob, now 90, stood tall in a borrowed suit, holding Daniel's arm. They unveiled the plaque together. A brass engraving showed a silhouette of two figures under a clock. The crowd applauded. Somewhere, Daniel knew, his mother was applauding too. He felt her in the breeze that rustled the autumn leaves, in the click of a camera, in the faint whistle of a distant freight train, reminding him that the past is never really past. It just waits for someone brave enough to open the locker. In the aftermath, Daniel returned to his teaching job, but he was different. His lectures on the Cold War now carried a personal weight. He told his students about the hidden heroes, the librarians, the journalists, the ones who never made the textbook, but whose fingerprints were all over history. He taught them that every era has its unknown jackals and its unsung saints, and that sometimes the most powerful force isn't ideology, but love. One afternoon, a quiet girl in the back row raised her hand and asked, "Mr. Harper, what happened to the locket, the one your mother left?" He smiled, reached into his collar, and pulled out the silver chain. He'd worn it ever since that night in the attic. "I'm keeping it," he said, "for my son." The class fell silent. Daniel had no son yet, but maybe someday. And if he did, that child would know the story, would know that love and courage are hereditary, and that a train station in Ohio once held the secret to a family's redemption and a nation's integrity. He looked out the window at the autumn sky, and for the first time in his life, the history he lived felt like it was still being written, with him as an author, not just a student. And somewhere in a cabin in Montana, an old man was planting tulip bulbs for spring, finally at peace. But peace, as Daniel was learning, does not arrive in a single ceremony or podcast. It comes in waves, often chased by undertow. A few weeks after the dedication, he received an anonymous letter, no return address, postmarked from Washington, D.C. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typewritten message. "You have awakened ghosts that were better left sleeping. Some of us still have much to lose. Cease your public appearances, or consequences will follow." The paper bore no signature, but a faint watermark of an eagle. Daniel's blood chilled. He called Sarah immediately. She was alarmed, but not entirely surprised. There were lots of people complicit in Cross's network who were never prosecuted. Their children, their political heirs, some of them are still in power. Your story might be reopening old wounds that certain families would prefer stayed closed. Daniel hadn't considered that. He'd been so focused on exonerating his parents that he'd forgotten history isn't just about the dead. It's about the living who inherited their secrets. He stared at the letter, the threat lying flat and cold on the kitchen table. Should he stop? Should he go silent? But then he thought of his mother's courage, her fainting spell in the dining car, her quiet years of sacrifice. He thought of Jacob handing over the film, telling him to make Eleanor the hero. He couldn't stop. He wouldn't. He took a photo of the letter, sent it to Sarah's encrypted account, and said, "Dig deeper. I want to know who still cares about a 60-year-old train ride." Sarah's investigation led them to a name: Senator Thomas Cross III, the grandson of Harlan Cross. He was a well-respected politician from Illinois, known for his foreign policy expertise and his family's long legacy. He'd never been implicated in any wrongdoing, but his political capital was built partly on the myth of Harlan Cross's tragic, undeserved death. Daniel's story, which detailed Harlan Cross's treason, threatened to shatter that myth. If the full truth were accepted, the Cross dynasty could be tarnished. It didn't take much digging to find that the senator's office had made quiet inquiries about legal options to challenge the narrative. They'd even hired a historian to produce a counter-narrative, claiming the microfilm was forged. Sarah managed to get a leak from a disgruntled staffer. There was also talk of suing Daniel for defamation, or worse, planting stories about his own character. Daniel felt the knot in his stomach tighten. He wasn't a fighter, he was a teacher. But Jacob had given him a simple piece of advice when he'd mentioned the threat. Bullies run on fear. When you shine a light on them, they scatter like roaches. So Daniel decided to preempt the attack. Instead of retreating, he would host a live-streamed public lecture at the restored Grandview station, presenting the evidence, the film, the letters, and the full story, inviting everyone, including the Cross family, to join. He'd put it all in the open. If they wanted to come after him, they'd have to do it in front of the world. He set the date, December 12th, the anniversary of the day the microfilm arrived at the Washington Post. The weeks leading up to the event were a blur of preparation and anxiety. Daniel and Sarah sifted through the original microfilm canister. It had been in the safe deposit box all along, tiny and unassuming. Sarah had it digitized by a forensics expert. The intelligence community's old guard was resistant, but a few retired agents came forward to vouch for the authenticity. One, an elderly man named Gerald, who'd been a young analyst in '63, flew out to meet Daniel. He confirmed that the microfilm had saved his own father, an undercover agent in Poland. He wept as he held the canister. That canister now sat in a glass case at the front of the station, like a holy relic. Daniel also interviewed more people from the town, descendants of those who'd helped his parents. A woman in her 50s, granddaughter of the station master who'd looked the other way, shared letters her grandfather wrote, regretting he couldn't do more. The community was rallying around the story. Even the diner on Main Street started offering a Midnight Express burger. The ghost story was becoming a local legend, but Daniel knew the hardest part was yet ahead. The Cross family's legal team sent a cease and desist, which Sarah's lawyer laughed at and framed. Still, the pressure was mounting. Daniel found himself waking at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was strong enough to carry this burden. Then he'd run his thumb over the locket and remember his mother's words. If only we hadn't boarded that train. But they had, and so had he. On the morning of December 12th, Grandview was buzzing in a way it hadn't since the 1960s. News vans lined the street. A small stage had been erected on the platform, with a projector screen and chairs for 200 people. People came from as far as California, descendants of the agents who'd been saved, historians, podcast listeners, and, Daniel knew, a few reporters from outlets sympathetic to Cross's camp, ready to pounce on any inconsistency. Jacob had flown in 2 days earlier, staying in the motel where Daniel had first read the letters. He was frail but determined. "I want to be there," he'd said. "I want to see her vindicated with my own eyes." Marion Henshaw, now in a wheelchair, was brought by her nurse. The station clock, finally repaired with donated funds, was set to tick for the first time in 50 years, scheduled to chime at the end of the event. The symbolism was almost too perfect. Daniel stood backstage, going over his notes, heart pounding. Sarah squeezed his hand. "You're not just telling your family's story anymore. You're giving a voice to everyone who ever had to hide their truth. Go out there and make history." And with that, he stepped onto the platform, the winter sun breaking through the clouds, and faced a sea of expectant faces and history itself.
Daniel's speech lasted 43 minutes. He spoke without teleprompters, just the weight of memory. He recounted discovering the photograph in the attic, the journey to the station, the locker, the letters. He showed the 8mm film to the crowd, the grain and flicker proof that love once danced here. He read aloud the final journal entry and his mother's hidden letter. Then, with a steady voice, he detailed the crimes of Senator Cross, not as an attack, but as a necessary context. He acknowledged the pain of the Cross family, but insisted that truth cannot be sacrificed to protect a legacy built on falsehood. He didn't mention the threatening letter, but everyone could sense the undercurrent of resistance he was facing. When he projected the declassified documents and the microfilm's contents, agent names redacted for privacy, a murmur went through the crowd. The evidence was overwhelming. Then he brought Jacob onto the stage. The old man walked slowly with a cane, but stood firmly beside his son. Daniel placed his arm around him and said, "This is John Victor, known to history as Jack Vance. He's not a spy, he's a patriot, and he's my father." The applause was thunderous, rolling through the depot like the ghost of a long-departed train. Camera shutters clicked. A journalist in the front row from a major network had tears in her eyes. And then, exactly as planned, the station clock began to tick, the hands moving from 12:05 to 12:06 for the first time in decades, a symbolic step from frozen past into living present. The event went viral. Clips of Jacob and Daniel on stage were shared millions of times. The phrase, "love becomes history," trended on social media. But this time, it was celebratory, not mysterious. Donations poured into a fund to fully restore Grandview Station as a museum. Even the diner got a boost. But the real shift happened offline, in the quiet spaces of power. Facing public scrutiny, Senator Cross III issued a cautious statement, neither admitting nor denying his grandfather's guilt, but announcing he would not pursue any legal action and that he wished the Harper-Vance family peace. It was a retreat, graceful in its own way, but a retreat nonetheless. Daniel felt no triumph, only relief. The shadow that had threatened him receded.
Yet the experience had changed him profoundly. He realized that his teaching career, his podcast, his life's work were all converging on a single theme. The personal is historical, and the historical is personal. He decided to expand the story further. With Sarah's help, he compiled all the interviews into a book, which he titled The Station Where Love Derailed History. It became a New York Times bestseller. But through it all, he remained anchored by the locket, the film, and the weekly calls with Jacob. He visited Montana every month now. They'd sit on the porch and talk about nothing and everything, baseball, the weather, Eleanor's laugh. And in those moments, the history he'd uncovered felt less like a campaign and more like a homecoming. 6 months later, in late spring, Daniel received another letter, this one welcomed. It was from the director of the National Archives. They wanted to acquire the original microfilm, the letters, and the journal for a new exhibit, Unsung Heroes of the Cold War. The curators had crafted a special section dedicated to Eleanor and Jack, complete with a recreation of Locker 17 and the frozen clock. Daniel agreed on one condition, that the exhibit would include a note about the importance of librarians, journalists, and ordinary citizens who risk everything for truth. The director agreed without hesitation. So, on a warm June day, Daniel stood in the rotunda of the National Archives in Washington, D.C., next to the Constitution itself, handing over the satchel to the archivist of the United States. Jacob, too frail now for long trips, watched via video call from Montana, held by a nurse. His face, pixelated but beaming, filled an iPad screen. The moment was quiet and profound. A librarian from Eleanor's old library in Willow Creek attended, and she whispered to Daniel that the library board had voted to rename the local history room the Eleanor Harper Memorial History Wing. He nearly broke down when he heard that. The woman who had spent her life in quiet service, protecting secrets, would finally have her name on a wall, not for the secrets, but for the stories she guarded until the world was ready. Daniel gave a short speech, quoting his mother's favorite line from Dostoevsky, "Beauty will save the world." Then he corrected himself. Love and truth, working together, that's what saves it. That night, back in his childhood home, now his own home since he'd decided not to sell, Daniel sat in his mother's old rocking chair. The house was much the same, but the secret had been replaced by a kind of vibrational peace. He hadn't just inherited a house, he'd inherited a mission. His podcast, The Soul Stories, had grown beyond the Cold War. Listener mail poured in, people describing their own family secrets, their own hidden histories, asking for guidance on how to uncover truth without destroying relationships. He started a spin-off series, Letters to Eleanor, where he read and responded to these stories, always emphasizing compassion, patience, and the idea that sometimes the greatest act of love is waiting until someone is ready to be found. He realized he was becoming a kind of secular confessor, a guide for people navigating the labyrinth of inherited silence, and he was good at it. His mother, the librarian, had taught him that every book has a reader, every story a purpose. He now extended that purpose to strangers. One letter from a woman in Nebraska told him that his story about Eleanor had given her the courage to contact her biological father after 40 years. Another, from a retired intelligence officer, confessed that he'd been part of the team that pressured the FBI to close the Vance case, and he'd carried guilt his whole life. Daniel's forgiveness meant everything. Daniel wrote back to each, his heart fuller than he ever imagined possible. The train station love had not just become history, it had become a living network of healing. As the first anniversary of his discovery approached, Daniel decided to hold a private memorial at the station for his mother. It wasn't a public event, just him, Sarah, Jacob, who made the trip one last time, Marion, and a few close friends from Willow Creek. They gathered on the platform at sunset, the clock now working faithfully. The station restoration was almost complete, but the locker room remained untouched, a preserved sanctum. Daniel read aloud the very first letter his mother wrote to Jack, the one about missing the train and finding a miracle. He read it with a gentle, steady voice, while the others held candles. Then Jacob, with great effort, stood and placed a single white rose inside locker 17. He spoke just a few words. "Thank you for waiting. I'm coming home soon." No one understood exactly what he meant except Daniel, but a quiet understanding settled over the group. The wind picked up slightly, making the flames dance, and for a fleeting second the scent of vanilla, Eleanor's lotion, seemed to drift through the air. Whether it was imagination or something more, Daniel didn't care. He felt her presence, her approval. The station was no longer a tomb of secrets. It was a sanctuary, and history, having been told, could finally rest. A few months later, Jacob passed away quietly in his sleep, a book about birds open on his chest. Daniel was with him, having come for his weekly visit. The old man had been talking about Eleanor the night before, recounting the exact shade of blue of her dress, the way she'd bite her lip when concentrating. He went to bed smiling, and in the morning he was gone. Daniel sat with him for an hour, holding his hand, saying his own goodbye. The funeral was private, back in Grandview, next to the station. Jacob's wish was to be cremated and to have his ashes scattered along the tracks where it all began. The town came out in force, lining the platform. The mayor gave a short speech, and Daniel, with a heavy but full heart, released the ashes as a freight train passed, blowing its whistle in tribute. The dust mingled with the steam and the wind, and Daniel imagined Jack and Eleanor finally reunited, boarding that midnight train together, this time with no fear, no secrets. He tucked the experience into the final chapter of his book, and when it was published in paperback, he added an epilogue, a letter to his unborn child, if ever there was one. "Dear little one, you come from a line of people who loved so fiercely that they changed the world without asking for credit. Don't be afraid of secrets, just be brave enough to uncover them when the time is right. And always, always believe in the power of a train station at midnight." In the quiet after Jacob's death, Daniel experienced something unexpected, a deep, profound stillness. The urgency was gone, the battles were fought, the truth was out, And for the first time in over a year, he didn't wake up with a knot in his stomach. He had accomplished what he set out to do, not just clearing his father's name, but understanding his mother's heart. He spent a week just gardening, pulling weeds in the backyard where Eleanor had once grown tomatoes. He fixed the creaking attic stairs, and he didn't feel the specter of sadness there anymore. He turned the attic into a small writing studio, hanging the restored film stills on the wall and installing a comfortable chair. He began writing his next podcast series, not about family secrets, but about everyday heroism. The waitress who covers a shift and saves a life. The bus driver who stops an abduction. The quiet bravery that never makes headlines. He realized that his parents' story was extraordinary, but it was also universal. Everyone had a hidden chapter. And maybe, he thought, his mission was to help people find the courage to write theirs. He titled the new series The Quiet Protagonists, and he dedicated it to Eleanor and Jack. The podcast's intro featured the sound of a train whistle and his mother's favorite Patsy Cline song. Every morning he made coffee, opened the attic window, and let the world pour in, one story at a time. The universe, as if in approval, sent Daniel a final gift. At a teachers' conference in Philadelphia, he met a woman named Kate. She was a high school English teacher from New Jersey, with a laugh that reminded him of wind chimes and a passion for forgotten authors. They were seated next to each other at a workshop on teaching empathy through literature. They started talking and didn't stop for 5 hours. She'd listened to the soul stories, she said, and the Midnight Express episode had made her cry on her commute. She'd even visited the station. He found himself telling him things he hadn't told anyone else, about the fear, the threatening letter, the feeling of his father's hand in his at the end. She listened with a quiet intensity that made him feel seen. They exchanged numbers. Within a month, they were dating. Within a year, they were engaged. Kate had a deep respect for history, and when Daniel finally took her to the station at midnight, showing her the locker, the clock, the tracks, she knelt on the platform and asked him to marry her right there, under the clock. He laughed and cried and said yes. The station, which had once been a stage for secrets and farewells, became a place of new beginnings. And Daniel realized that his parents' love story wasn't just something to be preserved, it was an invitation to write his own. Their wedding was small, held in the restored Grandview Station, naturally. The old waiting room, now a historical exhibit by day, was transformed with string lights and wildflowers. Marion, bundled up and smiling, was the flower girl. Sarah officiated, having gotten ordained online just for the occasion. And the guest of honor, in spirit, was a framed photograph of Eleanor and Jack on the day of that last kiss, placed on an easel near the altar. Daniel wore his father's old pocket watch, found in the cabin. Kate wore a blue dress, a nod to Eleanor. They exchanged vows that spoke of trains and stations, of journeys and arrivals, of learning that the most important stops aren't the ones on a schedule, but the ones where love finds you. When they kissed, the station clock chimed noon, and the small crowd cheered. The town bakery had made a cake shaped like a vintage train car, and outside, on the tracks, a rail photography club had positioned an old restored locomotive from the 1960s to serve as the backdrop for photos. It felt like the whole town had adopted Daniel and Kate. After the ceremony, the couple took a brief walk along the tracks, just the two of them. Daniel pointed to the spot where Jack had jumped from the train, now overgrown with black-eyed Susans. He said, "Everything that broke then has healed here. Thank you for being part of that healing." Kate kissed his cheek and whispered, "We're writing our own history now." A year into their marriage, Kate announced she was pregnant. Daniel felt a joy so profound it scared him. He thought about his own father, about the decades of sacrifice, the hidden love, the watched but never held birthdays. He swore he would give this child the one thing Jacob couldn't give him: presence. He'd be there for every skinned knee, every school play, every history fair. He'd tell the story of their incredible grandparents, not as a cautionary tale, but as a legacy of bravery. He began writing a letter to his child, the one he'd imagined in the epilogue, but longer, fuller. He filled a journal with it, updating it as the due date approached. On a rainy night in March, Kate gave birth to a baby girl. They named her Eleanor, but they'd call her Nora. Daniel held her, swaddled in a blanket knitted by a women's group in Grandview, and felt the weight of generations settle into his arms. He saw his mother's chin, Jack's eyes, and Kate's smile all at once. "Hello, little history. You have quite the story waiting for you." And just for a moment he thought he heard, in the rhythm of the rain against the window, the distant sound of a train passing through. As Nora grew, the station remained a family touchstone. Every July 12th, they'd visit Grandview for a small festival the town now held, Love Finds You Day, complete with music, food trucks, and a nighttime reenactment of the 8mm film Dancing. Nora, by age 5, could recite the story of her grandparents, and she'd tell anyone who'd listen that her Nano and Nana were secret superheroes who rode trains and saved the world. She'd press her face against the glass of locker 17, now containing a replica diary and a plaque, and she'd say, "When I grow up, I want to be a librarian and a spy." Daniel would laugh, but he also knew the deeper truth. She was already her grandmother's echo, a curious, compassionate soul who asked piercing questions and never stopped searching for the good in people. Kate, ever the English teacher, helped Nora make little books about the family history, with drawings and stickers. One of them, "The Girl in the Blue Dress," was featured in the local museum. The circle continued. And Daniel, the history teacher turned storyteller, sat back on those train platform benches and marveled at how a single photograph discovered in a dusty attic had not just rewritten the past, but planted an entire future. The station taught him that history is never truly finished. It breathes in the people who remember, and it grows in the ones who carry it forward. But life, like history, has a way of introducing new layers just when you think the book is closed. When Nora was 10, a letter arrived from Switzerland. It was from an elderly man named Victor, who claimed to be the son of the Soviet resident who'd been handling Senator Cross. He'd seen the story online, and after a lifetime of silence, he wanted to unburden himself. He offered to send Daniel a diary his father had kept, detailing the Soviet side of the operation, including a directive to eliminate Jack Vance if he interfered. Daniel was stunned. This was a missing piece of the puzzle he'd never expected. Victor's letter was full of guilt and a desperate need for absolution. He wrote, "My father was not a monster, but he did monstrous things in the name of country. I have spent my life trying to make amends. Your story gave me hope that reconciliation is possible. Please, I ask for nothing but a conversation." Daniel shared the news with Sarah, now working for an international outlet, and they verified Victor's identity. It was legitimate. So began another chapter, one that took him beyond American borders and into the heart of Cold War reckoning. Daniel and Sarah flew to Geneva to meet Victor, a frail man in his 80s, living in a modest apartment overlooking the lake. Over tea, Victor handed over a worn leather diary, written in Russian, and with the help of a translator, shared how his father had died in a car accident in 1974, haunted by the failure to stop the leak, never knowing that his own son would one day seek forgiveness on his behalf. Daniel realized that redemption isn't a straight line. It's a web that spans continents and generations. The Soviet diary was chilling. It confirmed not only Cross's treason, but also that the KGB had placed an agent in the FBI who actively worked to bury Jack's name and smear him as a spy. The diary included a passage, "We must ensure that the American journalist Vance is never believed. Discredit him, link him to us. If he is captured, he will be our scapegoat." This explained the decades of silence and the FBI's hasty closing of the case. It also meant that the threat level Jack and Eleanor faced was even greater than they knew. If Jack had been caught, he wouldn't have faced trial. He would have been executed or disappeared by a rogue faction within the Bureau. Learning this, Daniel felt both a fresh wave of grief and a renewed sense of awe at his parents' survival. He also discovered that Victor's father had a crisis of conscience late in life, which Victor believed contributed to his early death. The diary's final entry read, "What have I done? These people were only trying to protect their child. I see my own son's face in the mirror, and I am ashamed." The weight of history was immense, but so was the capacity for remorse. Daniel and Victor spent hours talking, not as sons of enemies, but as men bound by a shared recognition that the past holds pain that can only be healed through truth. Before leaving, Daniel gave Victor a copy of his book with a note, "Your father's remorse is part of this story now. We are all human. Thank you for your courage." They parted with an embrace. Back home, Daniel integrated the Soviet diary into an updated version of the podcast and book with Victor's permission. The response was massive, especially in academic and diplomatic circles. A joint resolution was introduced in Congress to officially recognize the contributions of Jack Vance and Eleanor Harper, with a posthumous Presidential Medal of Freedom. The resolution passed with bipartisan support, a rare moment of unity. Daniel was invited to the White House for the ceremony. Standing in the East Room beside Sarah and Kate and little Nora, he watched as the president spoke of two ordinary citizens who changed the world through love and conviction. The medal was given to Daniel to keep, to be placed eventually in the National Archives exhibit. He addressed the small gathering briefly. "My parents never sought this. They sought only the truth and the safety of their child. But today, they represent something larger. The idea that history is not merely shaped by generals and presidents, but by librarians and journalists and families who dare to do right when doing right costs everything. Keep that in mind the next time you miss your train." Laughter rippled. Nora, in a white dress, clutched her grandmother's locket that Daniel had given her on her 10th birthday. She was proud, not just of the medal, but of the quiet knowledge that love itself was the most powerful force in any conflict. And Daniel realized that his parents' story had now been woven into the official fabric of the nation, a permanent correction, a moral footnote turned into a headline.
With the medal came a renewed wave of media attention. But Daniel handled it differently now. He'd become seasoned, less a man chasing ghosts and more a guardian of a legacy. He used the spotlight to advocate for historical truth commissions, for supporting journalists under threat, for funding local libraries. He spoke at the American Library Association's National Conference, telling thousands of librarians that they were the invisible first responders of democracy. He told Eleanor's story, and by the end, half the room was in tears. He visited schools, not as the famous podcaster, but as Mr. Harper, a teacher who believed in the power of curiosity. He always started his talks by holding up the pink train ticket and asking, "What small object in your house might change everything if you looked closer?" That single ticket had become an icon, and replicas were sold in the Grandview Museum gift shop, proceeds funding scholarships for aspiring history teachers. But the real reward was the quiet transformation in his own heart. He no longer felt the sting of lost time with his parents. He felt a constant, warm connection. Every time he saw a station, he didn't see a place of departure, but a threshold where anything was possible. He'd become the living proof that the past is not a chain, but a compass.
Years rolled by. Nora grew into a thoughtful, whip-smart teenager who inherited her parents' love of stories and her grandparents' quiet determination. One spring day, when she was 16, she asked her father if they could take a road trip, just the two of them, to all the places that mattered in the family saga. They planned a route: Willow Creek Attic, the library wing, the bank in Harrisburg, the motel in Grandview, the cabin in Montana, now owned by a nature conservancy but with a plaque, and finally the White House if they could swing a tour. It was a pilgrimage, a way for Nora to connect with the story that had so shaped her identity. They filmed parts of it for a special episode of The Soul Stories, with Nora co-hosting. She had a natural microphone presence, and listeners loved the father-daughter dynamic. They laughed about the time she tried to lock herself in locker 17 as a kid, and they cried when they stood at Jacob's grave in the Montana mountains. Daniel watched his daughter kneel at the gravesite and whisper, "I'll tell your story forever, Grandpa." He knew then that the flame had been passed. The journey was documented, and the resulting podcast episode, The Soul Stories, Generations, became the most listened to of all, a love letter to family and to the bridges we build across time.
The episode dropped on a Tuesday, and by Thursday, something extraordinary began. Listeners started sending in their own family pilgrimage ideas. A man from Texas retraced his grandfather's journey as a migrant worker. A woman from Maine traced her grandmother's escape from Eastern Europe. The soul stories had become a movement, not just about Daniel's story, but about collective memory, about the idea that everyone holds a piece of history in their DNA. Daniel and Sarah, who had stayed a core collaborator, created a non-profit called the Station Project, dedicated to helping individuals uncover and share their hidden family histories, with grants for research, DNA kits, and oral history training. They held workshops in small towns, often in old train stations when possible. The ribbon of connection stretched across the country. Daniel often thought back to that first night in the attic, staring at a photograph, and marveled at the improbable chain of events. From a forgotten kiss to a national movement, love really did become history. And not just his love, but the love of thousands who followed his lead and unearthed their own forgotten platforms. The station metaphor held. Everyone had a departure point, a missed train, a connection they never expected. And sometimes all it took was a single person brave enough to open a locker. But Daniel's own journey wasn't immune to fresh mystery. One afternoon, an elderly woman showed up at his doorstep in Willow Creek. She introduced herself as Lydia, a former intelligence secretary who had worked briefly in the same office as the compromised FBI agent. She'd kept silent for decades out of fear, but now terminal illness had freed her. She carried a manila envelope with documents that she'd copied before retiring, proof that the rogue FBI agent, a man named Mulroney, had continued to surveil Eleanor until her death, and had even placed a listening device in the Harper home in the 1980s. Daniel was shocked. His mother's quiet life had been under surveillance? Lydia explained that Mulroney feared Eleanor might eventually talk, so he kept tabs, but when she stayed silent, he let her be. The documents included a transcript of a phone call where Eleanor, clearly aware, said to a friend, "They're always listening, but they'll never hear what they want. I buried the truth where only love can dig it up." Daniel's eyes filled. She'd known. All those years, knitting and reading, she'd been watched, and she'd been defiantly, beautifully silent. He thanked Lydia for her bravery and added this final layer to the archive. Now, when he told the story, he included the fact that Eleanor had lived under a surveillance state, but never cracked. She was, in her own way, a spy, too. A spy for love. The revelation added a chilling but inspiring edge. It made him even more determined to protect the privacy of those who still needed to tell their stories. The Station Project flourished for a decade. Daniel, now in his 50s, with gray at his temples and a quieter energy, became a sought-after speaker and a mentor to young documentarians. He'd often bring Nora along, and she'd handle the social media and the outreach. They made a formidable team. One evening, after a successful fundraiser in Chicago, they took a walk along the lake. Nora, now in her 20s and studying history at college, turned to him and said, "Dad, I've been thinking. Grandma's story, your story, it's all about how love can become history. But what about the opposite? What about when history becomes love? Like how you fell in love with teaching, with Mom, with the truth. The history you found shaped your heart." Daniel stopped, struck by the insight. She was right. The past hadn't just been impacted by love. It had, in turn, filled his life with love. His relationship with Kate, his bond with Nora, his friendships, his purpose, all were born from the ashes of a hidden kiss at a train station. He hugged his daughter and said, "That's the real story, isn't it? It's a circle. Love makes history, and history, if we let it, can fill us with love." I think that's the lesson I want to leave behind, not just the facts, but the feeling. That night, he started a new podcast mini-series simply called The Circle, exploring true stories of how confronting the past can heal the present. It was his most personal work yet, and it resonated deeply with a world that was, at that moment, grappling with its own historical reckonings. The Circle series was an intimate, almost meditative podcast, with Daniel reflecting on the broader themes of guilt, forgiveness, and identity. He interviewed people on all sides of historical conflicts, descendants of Nazis and Holocaust survivors, children of Klansmen and civil rights marchers, families of both police and victims of police violence. He approached each with the same gentle, story-centered methodology he'd used for his own history. It was raw, sometimes painful, but always pointing toward reconciliation. The project garnered critical acclaim and some controversy. Many felt he was too soft, too quick to forgive. But Daniel's philosophy was unwavering. "I'm not saying to forgive without justice. I'm saying that until we truly understand the human stories behind the headlines, we're only fighting shadows. My mother could have hated the people who spied on her. Instead, she outlived them, raised me, and left me a trail of love to follow. That's the kind of victory I believe in." He wrote a book, The Circle, How Inherited Stories Shape Our Future, blending memoir, history, and a call for empathetic listening. The book was used in universities and community programs. Kate, ever his partner, helped him stay grounded, reminding him that his own story wasn't just about huge gestures, but about being present for a bedtime story or a sick cat. He never forgot that. On the 60th anniversary of the Midnight Express in July 2023, Grandview hosted its largest Love Finds You Day yet. The president sent a video message. The town unveiled a bronze statue of Eleanor and Jack dancing under the clock. Daniel, at 59, stood beside Kate, Nora, and now Nora's husband, a kind young architect who had designed the statue's base. A fourth generation was on the way. Nora was pregnant. The crowd of thousands included listeners, historians, and families who'd been touched by the station project. Marion, at 102, was the guest of honor in a flower-bedecked wheelchair. The repaired clock chimed, and a restored 1960s train pulled into the station, not to whisk anyone away, but to serve as a museum on wheels, filled with exhibits about the story. Daniel gave a speech that was less about the past and more about the future. He said, 60 years ago, a woman in a blue dress and a man with a satchel full of truth took a risk that rippled across time. Today, we are all part of that ripple. Ask yourself, what risk will you take for love, for truth? The next chapter of history is waiting on your answer. As the train whistled blue, confetti filled the air, and a little boy in the crowd wearing a conductor's hat asked his mom, was that man a superhero? His mom, a librarian from Indiana, smiled and said, yes, sweetheart, he still is. Later that evening, after the festival quieted, Daniel walked alone through the exhibits in the stationary train car. Each display, lovingly curated, held a piece of his life. His mother's library card, Jack's Minox camera, the silver locket on loan from Nora, and the original photograph, enclosed in a protective case with a plaque that read, "This kiss was the beginning of a new history for a nation and for a son." He stood there for a long time, breathing in the scent of old leather and engine grease. He thought about all the people who'd never been found, all the lockers left unopened, all the stories stuck in attics. But he also thought about the ones that had surfaced because someone dared to look. His phone buzzed, a message from Nora. "Baby's kicking, come feel." He smiled, touched the photograph's glass, and whispered, "I'll be right there." He walked out of the train car into the starry Ohio night, where the station clock glowed softly, reminding him that time doesn't just move forward, it echoes, it returns, it invites. The story that began with a question, what happens when love finds you at the train station, suddenly becomes history, had transformed into an answer that would outlive him, a love letter to the future, sealed with a kiss in 1963 and opened every single day by someone new. Months later, a granddaughter was born. They named her Eleanor Kate, but of course they called her Ella. Daniel held her in the same Willow Creek living room where he'd first seen the photograph. The house now had a new scent, baby powder and fresh flowers, but the old photographs lined the hallway like a gallery of angels. He whispered the same words to Ella that he'd whispered to Nora. "Hello, little history." And this time he felt the entire ancestral line present, a chain of hands stretching from the midnight platform to this very moment. Ella's arrival softened him further. He'd been the seeker, the storyteller, the activist, but now he was predominantly the grandfather. He'd take her on stroller walks to the library and show her the memorial wing named after her great-grandmother. He'd play the 8mm film on a digital screen, and she'd reach out for the dancing figures. He wrote her a letter to be opened on her 18th birthday, summarizing everything, but ending with, "You don't have to be a hero like them. You just have to remember that love is the bravest history. Whatever you do, do it with that truth in your pocket, like a ticket that's always valid." He sealed it with wax, using the old key from the locker as a stamp, leaving a ghostly impression of Locker 17. As the years unfurled, Daniel continued his work, but he scaled back. He entrusted many responsibilities to a board at the station project, to Nora's growing role, and to Sarah, who had become the executive director. The movement he'd started was now self-sustaining, a living organism of memory. He spent more time writing in the attic, where he'd placed a comfortable chair by the window overlooking the backyard. One fall afternoon, he sat down to write something he'd never attempted before, a novel, not a memoir, not history, but a love story inspired by his parents. He wanted to explore their interior worlds, what they thought, what they feared, what they hoped, in a way that strict non-fiction couldn't capture. The novel was called The Blue Dress. It took him 3 years to finish. It was published just before his 65th birthday and became a quiet bestseller, praised for its lyrical prose and emotional depth. Critics called it a masterful meditation on the cost of courage. But for Daniel, it was simply a way to spend more time with them, to imagine the conversations he never heard, the quiet moments that history couldn't record. In the writing, he found a final kind of peace, transforming loss into art. The final line of the book: "She wore blue because it was the color of the sky just before dawn, the color of hope you can only see if you've been waiting all night." Eventually, the day came when Marion Henshaw, the last direct witness, passed peacefully at 104. The town mourned. Her funeral was held at the station, and Daniel gave the eulogy. He spoke about how a waitress with an eye for courage had been the quiet anchor of the whole operation. Without Marion, Eleanor might not have escaped. Without her, the safe deposit key might never have been delivered. He read a passage from The Blue Dress that was based on her, and the crowd included many station project volunteers who saw her as a matriarch. Afterward, Daniel and Kate walked quietly to the station platform, now as familiar as their own backyard. He said, "We're the keepers now." She squeezed his hand. "You've been the keeper, now you're the elder." He chuckled, feeling the truth of it. That evening, the town council dedicated the station's clock tower to Marion, adding a small plaque, "For Marion Henshaw, who showed that courage is not just in grand gestures, but in what you do with a spilled tray of dishes." Daniel thought of the sprawling web, a waitress, a librarian, a journalist, a son, a granddaughter. History was not a column of solo heroes. It was a woven cloth, and every thread mattered. He made a mental note to add that to his next talk. But that right then, he stood in the quiet, watching the stars come out, and felt an infinite gratitude for being one of those threads. One crisp April morning, Daniel found himself in the attic again. This time not searching, but tidying. He came across his old teaching materials, his mother's knitting needles, and the original lockbox, now empty, but still carrying the faint scent of vanilla. He sat down heavily, his joints reminding him of his years, and let the quiet settle. He thought about the title that had started it all. What happens when love finds you at the train station, suddenly becomes history? If he could answer it again, he'd say, it becomes a thread that ties strangers together across generations. It becomes a memory that outlasts empires. It becomes a child's bedtime story, a student's thesis, a traveler's reason to look twice at an old station. It becomes a key in a locker, a blue dress in a museum, a plaque on a wall, a podcast in someone's ear as they commute. But most of all, it becomes a living, breathing reminder that we are all just passengers, and the most important thing isn't the destination, but who we meet along the way, and what we're willing to risk for them. He closed the lockbox and placed it on the windowsill, letting the morning sun fill the empty space with light. He wasn't sad, he was complete. The story had become history, and the history had become a gift that kept giving long after the last train left the station. Not long after, an unexpected artifact surfaced. A metal detectorist exploring the old drainage culvert near Grandview, the one where Jack had hidden after jumping from the train, found a rusty but intact Minox film canister. He brought it to the Historical Society. Inside was a short, undeveloped film strip. When experts carefully developed it, they found 3 images. The first was a clear shot of Senator Cross's briefcase, open, showing the microfilm inside, the evidence. The second was a blurry photo of Eleanor, taken probably in haste, smiling over her shoulder, a cup of coffee in her hand, caught in a moment of pure, unguarded joy. The third was a selfie-like reflection, Jack's own face in a train window, grim yet resolved, his eyes holding the weight of what he was about to do. The images made national news again. They were the perfect bookend, the last breadcrumb. Daniel traveled to see them as soon as he could. He held the developed prints, now encased in a new display in the train car museum. The image of Eleanor, that stolen smile, undid something in him. It was the most alive he'd ever seen her. He realized that Jack must have carried these undeveloped images with him until he had to ditch them in the culvert, and they'd waited 65 years to be seen. He laughed. Even from beyond, his parents were still sending messages. The final exhibit was titled The Last Frame. Under each photo, a caption: the crime, the love, the choice. In the wake of the discovery, Daniel gave one final major interview, a televised sit-down with a respected journalist who'd covered the story from the start. It was in the Grandview station, the clock ticking naturally behind them. They talked for 2 hours. At the end, the journalist asked, "What do you want people to take away from all of this? The story of the Midnight Express, your parents, your own journey?" Daniel leaned forward, thought for a moment, and said, "I want people to look at their own parents, their own grandparents, and realize that they were once young, once scared, once wildly in love and making impossible choices. I want them to ask questions before it's too late. And I want them to know that history isn't a dry recitation of facts. It's the record of human hearts under pressure. If you can approach it with compassion, you might just find yourself in it. Our stories don't end when we die. They echo until someone is ready to listen. That's what the station taught me." The interview aired a week later, on what would have been Eleanor's 90th birthday. Around the country, viewers wrote in saying they'd just called their moms, sorted through old photos, or finally asked about that one family mystery. The reaction was a testament to the power of vulnerability. Daniel's own journey had started with a question and ended by inspiring a million more. Daniel's own beloved Kate, partner through all the tumult, fell ill unexpectedly. It was a swift, cruel illness, and within a few months she was gone. The man who had uncovered a century's worth of secrets found himself wholly unprepared for the silence of loss. For the first time since he was a young man, grief was a dark attic he didn't want to enter. But he did enter. He grieved with the same patience and honesty he'd brought to the archival research. He let himself weep in the garden where she'd planted tulips. He reread the letters she'd written him, the way he'd read his mother's. And he realized that this too was a story, the one about how love that becomes history is still love, and loss is the last chapter of that love, not the erasure of it. Nora and Ella moved in for a while, and the old house filled with the noise of a toddler and the quiet talks of a daughter who understood. They'd watch the 8mm film and Kate's wedding video side by side, and they'd cry and laugh. Daniel learned that the station metaphor extended to grief. You can't stay on the platform forever, but you can always return, and the train of life keeps arriving, whether you're ready or not. He dedicated the next season of the Soul Stories to Kate, telling stories of enduring love in the face of loss, and he found that in giving voice to his pain, he made room for others to share theirs. The circle, as he well knew, never breaks. On a clear, cold morning in January, Daniel, age 76, stood on the platform at Grandview one last time. The station was closed for the season, but the caretaker had let him in for a private moment. He carried a fresh ticket, not a real one, but a replica printed by the museum, stamped with the date and the words, "All tickets valid." He walked to locker 17, now a permanent display, and slipped the ticket through the small opening. A small gesture, but it meant, "I'm still here, and I'm still traveling with you." The restoration of the station had won preservation awards, and a documentary about it had just premiered. The town had planned to honor him again at the upcoming Love Finds You festival, but he'd politely declined. He wanted the focus to be on the story, not on him. He was just a history teacher who'd opened a lockbox. The real stars were the librarian and the journalist and the waitress and the thousands who now kept the flame. He walked the platform, feeling the cold air, recalling the first time he'd stepped out of his Subaru all those years ago. He smiled at the memory of his determination, his fear, his loneliness. Now he felt none of those. He felt accompanied. He sat on the bench beneath the clock, pulled out a small speaker, and played the Patsy Cline song, the one his mother loved. And he let the music wind through the empty station, a private concert for ghosts and memories, and a future that was no longer his to shape, only to witness with gratitude. As the song faded, Daniel rose, straightened his coat, and walked back along the tracks a little way, to the spot where the black-eyed Susans grew in summer, now just dried stalks under frost. He thought of Kate, of Jacob, of Eleanor and the blue dress. He thought of the baby named Ella, safe and warm at home, probably drawing a picture of a train. He thought of all the listeners, the letter writers, the secret keepers who'd become truth-tellers, and he thought, strangely, of the train that never was, the one his mother boarded, the one that jumped the tracks of her ordinary life and landed her in the annals of something far bigger. He whispered aloud, to no one but the wind, "Thank you for missing your train." Then he walked back to the parking lot, got into his trusty old car, and drove toward Willow Creek, toward the house where the attic waited, no longer a tomb, but a temple, no longer a question, but an answer. He flipped on the radio, and a news segment was discussing the documentary, calling the Midnight Express story one of the most remarkable love stories in American memory. He turned it off, content. He didn't need to hear it. He was living it. As the miles passed, the sun came out, low and golden, and Daniel Harper, son of Eleanor and Jack, teacher of history, keeper of a secret turned into a shared treasure, smiled the smile of a man who understood that love, true love, never ends, it just changes track. And somewhere, on a quiet station platform in time, a clock ticked not toward midnight, but toward morning.